She didn't make a scene. She didn't scream. She didn't storm down the aisle or point fingers or collapse in tears at the back of the church. She simply stood up, in the last pew, in a dress she had bought specifically for this moment, and she pressed play on her phone. And in the 47 seconds that followed, 200 people watched a wedding die. Not slowly, not with any mercy. All at once, the way a window shatters, complete and irreversible, and impossible to pretend you didn't see. And the bride's name was Margaret. The groom's name was Daniel. And the woman standing in the back of Riverside Methodist Church in Columbus, Ohio, on the morning of October the 14th, had driven 6 hours to be there for a woman she had never once met in her life. Her name was Claire, and she had not come to cause pain. She had come because she already knew what happened to women who married Daniel Carr. She had already been one of them. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And please hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming stories on Behind the Lie. Now, let us tell you everything. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a room when something has happened that cannot be taken back. It is not the silence of people being polite. It is not the silence of people waiting for someone else to speak first. And it is the silence of 200 human beings trying simultaneously to process information their minds were not prepared to receive, trying to reconcile what they thought they were doing in that building with what they now understood to be true. Margaret Hanson was still standing at the altar when that silence fell. She was still holding her bouquet. Her dress was still perfect, and the flowers her daughter Sarah had spent 3 weeks agonizing over were still arranged in the exact way they had been arranged at 7:30 that morning. Everything looked the same as it had 60 seconds earlier, and everything was different in a way that could never be undone. Because 47 seconds of audio had just told 200 people, in the plainest possible terms, that the man standing 6 feet in front of Margaret had not been who he said he was for a single day of the 3 years she had known him. Daniel Carr did not turn around. That is the detail that every witness who was in that church that morning came back to, over and over, in the days and weeks that followed, in the police interviews, in the statements given to federal investigators, in the conversations that happened in parking lots and living rooms and on telephone calls between people who had all attended the same wedding and all walked out of it carrying the same haunted question. He did not turn around. He stood at that altar with his back to the room, and he did not move, and he did not speak, and he did not perform any of the reactions that a genuinely innocent person performs when their world is suddenly and publicly dismantled. And he stood there the way a man stands when he is not surprised. The way a man stands when he has already, in the weeks prior, quietly calculated the odds of exactly this moment occurring, and decided that if it did, the best strategy was stillness, composure, the appearance of a man absorbing a shock rather than a man confirming one. It did not work. Because a room full of people who had spent 3 years watching Daniel Carr perform decency had just had their eyes opened, and what they saw in his stillness was not innocence. What they saw was the final piece of evidence. To understand why Claire was in that church, and what was on that recording, and what Daniel Carr had actually been doing during the 3 years Margaret believed she was building a life with him, you have to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of their relationship. The beginning of Daniel Carr himself. Because men like Daniel Carr do not arrive fully formed. They are built, slowly and deliberately, by a long succession of discoveries about what they are capable of getting away with. And the first of those discoveries According to the investigators who eventually spent 14 months reconstructing his timeline, happened not in Columbus, not in Indianapolis, but in a small city in western Tennessee, 20 years before Margaret Hanson ever heard his name. His legal name, as it turned out, was not Daniel Carr, and that was one of at least 4 names he had used across 5 states over 2 decades. His real name was David Russell Connor. He was born in 1969 in a small town outside of Memphis, the second of 3 children, and there was nothing in his early history that stood out to the people who knew him then as a warning of what he would become. He was average in school. He was polite to adults. He held a job at a hardware store through most of his teenage years, and he married for the first time at 22, a woman named Sandra who had grown up in the same neighborhood, and by all accounts that marriage was unremarkable for its first 4 years. It ended when Sandra discovered that he had been quietly draining their joint savings account for the better part of a year, transferring small amounts at irregular intervals into an account she did not know existed. When she confronted him, he denied it, then admitted it, then cried, then promised it would never happen again. She left anyway. He kept the account. And somewhere in the architecture of that first successful theft, from a person who trusted him completely, he discovered something about himself that would define the next 2 decades of his life. He discovered that he was very, very good at being believed. The women who came after Sandra were not chosen randomly, and they were not chosen carelessly. And this is something that investigators emphasized repeatedly in the documentation of his case, and something that the women themselves, once they had found each other and begun comparing notes, recognized with a clarity that was both illuminating and devastating. He had a type, not a physical type, an emotional one. He looked for women who were in a specific window of their lives, women who were somewhere between 40 and 55, who had been through a significant loss, a divorce, a death, and a period of prolonged loneliness, who had rebuilt themselves into something stable and independent, and who were, as a result of that rebuilding, both capable of sustaining a real relationship and hungry enough for one that they had started to let their guard down again. Women who were smart enough to evaluate a person carefully and lonely enough to want the evaluation to come back positive. Women who had stopped expecting perfection and had started hoping for real. He found these women in churches. He found them at community events and charity dinners and neighborhood associations. He found them in the specific social environments that are built around the extension of trust to strangers, because those environments made the initial work of gaining that trust faster and cleaner than it would have been anywhere else. He had a routine, and the routine did not vary significantly from city to city or from woman to woman, because it did not need to. But he arrived somewhere new, and he attended a church or a community event, and he introduced himself as a man who had recently moved from another state following the death of his wife. The wife was always dead. That detail was not accidental. A dead wife accomplishes several things simultaneously in the mind of a woman who is evaluating a new man. It explains why he is alone. It creates an immediate emotional bond through shared experience of loss. It positions him as someone capable of deep love and long commitment, since he clearly maintained a marriage until death ended it. And it closes off an entire avenue of investigation, because a dead woman cannot be called. He told the story with just enough specific grief in his voice to feel genuine and just enough restraint to feel dignified. And within weeks of arriving in each new city, he had made himself a known and trusted figure in whatever community he had chosen to enter. And that was always the first phase. It took patience. He had enormous patience. The second phase was the relationship itself. He never rushed it. He met women, and he listened to them, genuinely and attentively, in a way that women who had spent years feeling unheard found almost startling. He remembered what they told him. He followed up on things they had mentioned in passing. He showed up when he said he would. And he was kind to their children and respectful of their boundaries and affectionate without being overwhelming. He made himself, over the course of months, into the specific person each woman had been quietly hoping to find. Not a generic perfect man. The particular version of a good man that each specific woman needed most. That was the refinement of his method, and the thing that made it so effective. He did not run a script. He ran to the mirror, and he reflected back to each woman the version of love she had been missing. And then he let her fall in love with her own reflection, and believed she had fallen in love with him. The third phase was the money. It never came before the foundation was solid. He was careful about that. He understood, with the precision of someone who had made costly early mistakes and learned from them, that asking too soon broke the spell entirely, and that a broken spell was almost impossible to rebuild. So he waited. He waited until the woman was not just in love with him, but dependent on him in the small daily ways that make a person feel like another person has become part of the structure of their life. Until she was the one suggesting they combine finances. Until she was the one offering to co-sign. Until the financial request, when it finally came, felt not like a demand, but like a natural next step in a relationship that was already heading toward permanent. A construction loan that had hit a temporary cash flow problem. A business investment that needed a short-term bridge. A property deal that would benefit both of them once it closed. The amounts varied. The mechanism varied. The outcome never did. The money moved. He disappeared. And the woman he left behind spent the next months and years trying to understand how someone she had known so completely could turn out to be a person who had not existed at all. And the first woman that investigators were able to connect definitively to his history was a nurse named Donna in a mid-sized city in Indiana. She met a man calling himself David Caron at a hospital charity fundraiser 15 years before Margaret's wedding. She was 50 years old and had been widowed 2 years earlier, and she told investigators he was the most attentive man she had encountered since losing her husband. They dated for 7 months, and he told her about a construction project that had developed a temporary cash flow problem and needed a short-term bridge loan to cover payroll. She transferred $42,000. He was gone within 2 weeks of the transfer. She went to the police and was told it was a civil matter. She hired an attorney who traced the name David Caron to a shell company in a county she had never heard of, and found nothing else. What she did not know, sitting in her house in Indiana trying to find a man who no longer existed, was that 200 miles away, in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio, a man who sometimes used the name Daniel Carr and sometimes used the name Danny Crawford, and who had been many other people in many other places before either of those names, was attending a Saturday social at Riverside Methodist Church and introducing himself to a woman named Margaret Hanson. Margaret was 51 years old, and she was a school administrator, and she was, by every account of everyone who loved her, one of the most grounded women in her community. She had raised Tyler and Sarah on her own after her first marriage ended quietly, when they were in middle school. She had renovated her house room by room over 7 years. She had the kind of friendships that get built through genuine difficulty and survive it. She was not a woman who fell for things easily, and she was not naive, and she was not desperate, and she was not someone who ignored her instincts. She was a careful person who evaluated things carefully and trusted what the evaluation returned. And the evaluation, every single time she ran it on Daniel Carr, returned the same result: safe, kind, real, because he had spent 20 years making sure that was exactly what the evaluation returned, and he was better at it than she had any way of knowing to prepare for. But he had been at Riverside Methodist for 4 months before he met her. 4 months of showing up every Sunday, of learning names, of helping set up chairs for the Saturday social, of bringing food to the potluck dinners, and staying late to clean up. 4 months of being the kind of man that a community of people decides, gradually and collectively, that they are glad to have among them. By the time Carol introduced him to Margaret at the November social, he was not a stranger in that church, and he was a member of it. He had already done the work. The introduction was just the beginning of the next phase. They talked for 40 minutes that first evening. He asked about her job, and he listened to the answer, and he asked a follow-up question, which meant he had processed what she said rather than waiting for his turn to speak. He remembered the name of her school. He asked about Tyler and Sarah after she mentioned them once. When the evening ended and people were collecting their coats, he asked if he could call her, and he used her full name when he asked, which she would later tell Sarah she had found unexpectedly disarming without being entirely sure why. He called 3 days later. He took her to a restaurant she had mentioned wanting to try, in passing, in a detail she had half forgotten she shared. He was on time. He was everything he appeared to be. That was always, at every stage, entirely the point. And their relationship over the next 34 months looked, from the outside, like the exact thing every person who loved Margaret had been hoping would happen for her. He met her children at 6 months, not before, which she appreciated because it showed he was thinking about more than himself. He came to Tyler's birthday dinner. He helped Sarah move apartments in February of the second year and carried the heavy boxes without complaint. And he left flowers on her doorstep on the first anniversary of her mother's passing, without having mentioned he was going to do it, which undid her completely in the specific way that small, unrequested gestures of tenderness undo people who have not been on the receiving end of them in a long time. He came to school events. He met her friends. He was uniformly, consistently, without exception, the man he had presented himself as being on the evening Carol introduced them. Not because he had relaxed into genuine goodness, because he had not yet collected what he came for. And relaxing before that moment was a mistake he had made once, long ago, and never made again. He proposed on their 2-year anniversary with a ring Sarah said was exactly what she would have picked for her mother. Margaret said yes before he finished asking. They set a date 14 months out. She planned the wedding the way a person plans something they have waited a long time for, and with a specific and quiet gratitude in every decision. She chose the flowers. She chose the readings. She chose the song for the walk down the aisle. She wrote her own vows and cried while she was writing them because she meant every word, and she was grateful, in a way that went bone deep, that she had not given up on the possibility of this. She was happy in the way that comes from having stopped expecting something and then receiving it anyway. Her children were happy. Her friends were happy. At Pastor James Wilkins, who had known her for 11 years and had counseled her through the hard years, and who genuinely loved her the way that good pastors love the people in their care, told her at their last premarital counseling session that he had never seen her more at peace. She thanked him. She believed it was true. She had no idea what she did not know. What she did not know was that Daniel Carr was already legally married. Had been for 11 years. His wife, a woman named Patricia, lived outside of Nashville and believed that her husband was a construction consultant who spent extended periods working in the Midwest. She had not seen him in person in 4 months at the time he proposed to Margaret. She had spoken to him by phone the previous Sunday, and the conversation had been ordinary and brief, and she had not thought anything of it beyond that it was good to hear his voice. She had absolutely no reason to think otherwise. He had been careful. And he was always careful with Patricia, because Patricia was the wife he had no intention of leaving, the one who provided the stable home address and the clean legal identity and the permanent anchor point that made his movements across other states harder to trace. Patricia was not a victim in the way the other women were victims. She was a fixture. She was the thing he came back to. She was the part of his life that was, in its own particular way, real. What Patricia did not know was that she was not the only one, and what Margaret did not know was that she was not the only one either. There was a woman in Memphis named Beverly who had been engaged to him for 9 months and had lost most of her retirement savings to a real estate investment that existed only in the paperwork he had created for it. There was a woman in Kansas City named Renee who had co-signed a vehicle loan that was never paid and that destroyed her credit for 4 years. So there was a woman in Louisville named Diane who had transferred $68,000 in 3 separate installments over the course of 8 months for a construction project that no city in the state of Kentucky had any record of. And there was Claire. Claire was the one who had not just survived him, but had refused, after surviving him, to pretend that survival was the same thing as justice. So Claire Novak was 44 years old, and she was a paralegal at a family law firm in Pittsburgh, and she had been engaged to a man she knew as Daniel Crawford for 11 months when she found the first thread. A story told twice with different details in the middle. She brought it up, and he explained it, and she let it go. Then a second phone in his glove compartment explained away patiently, with the slightly wounded expression of a man whose privacy had been questioned without cause. Then a name in an open email attached to a transfer she had not been told about. Explained. Dismissed. Apologized by Claire herself, who was beginning to feel that her instinct to look was the problem rather than the things she was finding. And then the marriage certificate. Not a death certificate for the wife he said the cancer had taken. A marriage certificate from a county court in Tennessee, with his full legal name on it and the name of a woman who, as Claire spent 2 weeks confirming, was alive and employed and still legally married to him on the day Claire found the document in the filing cabinet he kept in her spare room. She ended the engagement at 2 in the morning by text message because she did not trust herself not to be talked out of it if she heard his voice, and she knew, with the bone-deep knowledge of someone who has sat across from a very skilled manipulator and watched their own judgment dissolve in real time, that he could do it. And he called 11 times in the following 2 days. She did not answer once. She went to the police in Indianapolis with the marriage certificate and the bank records. She was told it was insufficient for a criminal case. She went back 4 months later with statements showing he had moved $6,000 from their joint account into an unknown account 2 weeks before she ended the engagement. She was told the amount did not meet the threshold for felony prosecution. She contacted an advocacy organization that connected her to Donna and to Beverly. The 3 of them met by video call every 2 weeks for 4 months. They built a shared file that eventually ran to over 200 pages of documentation, cross-referenced timelines, financial records, corroborating accounts, and a map of his movements across 5 states that made the federal jurisdiction argument, in their view, entirely clear. They took that file in person onto the FBI field office in Indianapolis, and they presented it to an agent who listened carefully and told them the case was being referred to the Financial Crimes Unit. They left that meeting feeling, for the first time in over a year, that something was actually going to happen. In the 18 months that followed, they received 2 form letter emails from the field office. Nothing was filed. Nothing moved. And Daniel Carr continued his life in Columbus without a single interruption. And he continued attending church. He continued helping Sarah with things she needed. He continued being, to everyone who encountered him, the man he had never been. And he continued the financial arrangements he had been quietly putting in place in the months leading up to the wedding. Arrangements that Margaret did not know about. Arrangements that Claire had learned about through a recording she had obtained legally in a one-party consent state 11 months before the wedding. During a phone call she had initiated under a pretext with a number he did not recognize. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. The recording was 47 seconds. In those 47 seconds, he said enough about Margaret, about the wedding, about the accounts he was planning to restructure in the weeks immediately following the ceremony, to make the picture legally, completely, and permanently clear. Claire had listened to it dozens of times. She had sent copies to Donna and Beverly and her attorney. And when the Google alert she had set up 18 months earlier for his name combined with Columbus, Ohio returned a wedding announcement on a Tuesday morning in September. She listened to it one more time, and then she got in her car. She arrived in Columbus the evening before the wedding and stayed at a budget motel 6 miles from Riverside Methodist. She did not sleep. She lay in the dark, and she thought about Margaret Hanson, through whose photograph she had found on the school district website, who looked in that photograph like a woman who had earned every good thing that was coming to her, and who had absolutely no idea what was actually coming. She thought about what she was about to do to a room full of people who had gathered in good faith for something they believed in. She thought about it for a long time. And then she thought about Donna, who had spent 3 years and most of her savings trying to find a man who had ceased to exist the moment her money cleared. She thought about Beverly, who had attended the second of what would eventually be 3 court hearings, where a judge looked at the documentation and decided it was not quite enough to warrant real consequences. She thought about the agent at the FBI field office and the 2 form letter emails. She got up before 5. She put on the dress she had bought for this. She drove to the church. She sat in her car in the parking lot and watched families arrive and children run on the grass, and a grandmother being helped carefully up the stone steps by a young man who was clearly her grandson. She watched all of it for 40 minutes. And then she got out of the car and went in through the side door and took her seat in the last pew and waited for the one moment in a traditional wedding ceremony when anyone is technically permitted to speak. The ceremony was, even until that moment, everything Margaret had planned it to be. Tyler walked his mother down the aisle, and half the room was crying before she reached the front. Daniel stood at the altar in his charcoal suit, with an expression the photographer would later describe as one of the most convincingly emotional faces she had seen on a groom in 12 years of shooting weddings. He looked like a man who could not believe his own fortune. He delivered his handwritten vows in a voice that broke once, just once, at exactly the right moment, and the women in the front rows reached for their tissues, and the men straightened their jackets, and Margaret looked at him the way a woman looks at a person she has decided is worth every year of waiting. Pastor Wilkins spoke about courage, and about faith, and about the particular grace required to open your hands to love again after you have already survived losing it. And then he reached the moment that has been part of the marriage rite for centuries, the moment that everyone in every wedding always assumes is a formality. He asked, and Claire stood up. Every head turned. Margaret turned. The smile on her face did not leave immediately. It held there in the suspended confusion of a woman whose brain was receiving information It had no existing framework to process. She was still at the altar. She was still holding her peonies. Daniel did not turn around, and he went still in the precise and deliberate way of a man who has rehearsed this moment privately and knows exactly how to play it. Witness after witness, questioned separately, used the same words to describe his stillness. They said he looked like a man who already knew. Claire spoke clearly and without shaking. She said she was sorry to everyone in that room. She said she understood what she was about to do to this day. So she said that what they needed to hear was going to change what they chose to do next, and that they deserved to make that choice with the full truth in front of them. She looked at the back of Daniel's head. She said she was sorry, Margaret, and she pressed play. 47 seconds. It played at a volume that filled every corner of that church, in the silence that had fallen. Two voices. One was Daniel's, and the other was a woman's who was not Margaret, and was not Claire, and was not Patricia, and was, as investigators would later establish, a fifth woman. A woman in Cincinnati, who had been seeing him for 4 months, who believed he was single and recently widowed, and who had no idea that the man speaking so casually about the financial arrangements he planned to make after his wedding in Columbus was in fact discussing how to structure the theft of the life savings of the woman he was about to marry. When the recording ended, the church was so still that multiple witnesses later described hearing the air conditioning. Margaret had not moved. Her bouquet was still in her hands. Tyler had his hand on her arm. Sarah had both hands pressed over her mouth. And Daniel Carr still had not turned around. He did not turn around for another 12 seconds. The witnesses who were watching him counted. And when he finally turned, what was on his face was not guilt, and it was not shame, and it was not the shattered expression of a man whose deception had just been exposed. It was a calculation. It was the face of a man running options. He turned around, and he looked at Claire, and then he looked at the room, and then, for the first and only time that morning, he looked at Margaret. And whatever he saw in her face at that moment, whatever was in the expression of a woman who had just had 3 years of her life rewritten in 47 seconds, told him that the option he was looking for did not exist in that room. He stepped back from the altar. He said nothing. He walked up the center aisle past 200 people who had come to witness his wedding and out through the front doors of Riverside Methodist Church. And he did not look back. And the police were called within minutes, not by Margaret, who was sitting in the front pew with her daughter's arms around her, and her son kneeling in front of her holding her hands. By 3 separate guests, independently, who had taken out their phones before the recording had even finished. The first officer arrived at the church 17 minutes after the ceremony ended, and he took statements from Claire and from Margaret and from a handful of witnesses, and he was professional and he was thorough, and he was also, as he acknowledged to his supervisor later that afternoon, not entirely certain what charges to pursue, because what had happened inside that church was not, on its face, a crime that had a clean and obvious legal category. A man had attended his own wedding while legally married to another woman. He had made representations about himself that were false, and he had potentially been in the process of defrauding his bride, but potentially was not, actually. And on the morning of October the 14th, the full picture had not yet been assembled. That picture took 14 months to assemble. The Columbus Police Department opened a preliminary inquiry within 48 hours. It was upgraded to a full investigation on the 4th day, when a detective ran Daniel Carr's name through a national database and found 2 prior civil judgments in other states, an outstanding warrant in Iowa, and a marriage license filed in Davidson County, Tennessee, 11 years earlier. The Tennessee lead went to a federal contact in Nashville, who went to Patricia's front door on a Tuesday morning and explained to a woman who had believed she was in a normal, if geographically inconvenient marriage, that her husband was currently the subject of a multi-state fraud investigation and had been present at another woman's wedding in Ohio 6 days earlier. Patricia sat down on her porch steps and did not speak for a long time. When she finally spoke, she asked how many women there had been. Not as a question, and as a sentence from someone who already understood the shape of the answer and was simply asking for the number to make it real. The number, when the investigation was complete, was 7 confirmed victims across 5 states over a period of 19 years. 7 women who had believed they were in a real relationship with a man who was real. 7 women who had, at various points, given him access to their accounts, their credit, their property, their trust. Donna in Indiana, Beverly in Memphis, and Renee in Kansas City, Diane in Louisville, the woman in Cincinnati whose voice was on the recording, Patricia in Nashville, and Margaret. The total financial loss across all 7 women was calculated at just under $900,000. The total emotional cost was not calculated. It could not be. Daniel Carr was arrested 41 days after the wedding at a budget motel outside of Cincinnati, where he had been staying under a name investigators had not previously connected to him. And he did not resist the arrest. He was cooperative and polite with the arresting officers in the way that a man is cooperative and polite when he has already decided that cooperation is the most strategically sound position available to him. He was charged in federal court with wire fraud, bigamy, financial exploitation, and identity fraud. His attorney entered a not guilty plea. His bail was set at $400,000, and he did not make it, which meant he remained in custody through the entirety of the proceedings. That was the first time in 20 years that Daniel Carr had not been able to simply leave when leaving became necessary. The trial lasted 9 days. 6 of the 7 victims testified. Donna testified about the $42,000 and about the 3 years she spent afterward trying to find a man who had ceased to exist. Beverly testified about her retirement savings and about the 2 court hearings where she had watched a judge decide her losses did not warrant real consequences. Patricia testified, quietly and with extraordinary composure, about 11 years of a marriage she had believed was real. And Tuesday morning, a federal agent came to her porch and told her what her life had actually been. Claire testified last among the victims. She walked into that courtroom with 212 pages of documented evidence that she and Donna and Beverly had built together over 18 months, and she placed it on the stand in front of her. And she told the jury exactly how she had obtained the recording and exactly what it contained and exactly why she had gotten in her car on the morning of October the 14th and driven 6 hours to a church in Columbus, Ohio, for a woman she had never met. And she said, "I knew what was coming because I had already lived it. And I decided that living it once was enough for both of us." Margaret testified on the 8th day. She walked into that courtroom with the same composure she had walked through every room with for the 14 months since the wedding, the composure of a woman who had decided, somewhere in the worst of it, that she was not going to let what had been done to her define what she was capable of doing next. She sat in the witness chair, and she answered every question directly and completely, and she did not cry, though the women in the jury box did. She described the night he proposed. She described the morning of the wedding. She described the 47 seconds of audio playing through the speaker of Claire's phone, and what it felt like to stand at an altar holding flowers she had spent 3 weeks choosing, and hear the voice of the man she was about to marry, talking about her trust, as though it were a resource to be managed, rather than a gift that had been freely given. She said, "I did everything right. I was careful, and I was patient, and I paid attention, and I asked questions, and I took my time. And none of it mattered, because he was better at deceiving me than I was at detecting it." And then she paused for a moment, and she looked at the jury and she said, "And I needed you to understand that. Not so that you would feel sorry for me, so that you would understand that this was not carelessness. This was a man who had spent 20 years practicing, and who was very, very good." The jury deliberated for 6 hours and 20 minutes. They returned guilty verdicts on all 8 counts. And the judge sentenced Daniel Carr, whose legal name was David Russell Connor, to 16 years in federal prison. He was also ordered to pay restitution of $874,000 to the 7 women his crimes had been documented to affect. He said nothing when the sentence was read. He stood with the same stillness he had stood with at the altar on October the 14th, the stillness of a man running calculations that had, for the first time in 20 years, returned no viable result. Margaret Hanson was in the courthouse the day of sentencing. She sat in the gallery with Tyler on her left and Sarah on her right, and Claire Novak 3 seats down. They had been in contact since the week after the wedding, first through email, then by phone, and then, 6 weeks after the arrest, in person over coffee at a diner in Columbus. Margaret had been the one to reach out, and she had found Claire's contact information through the victim advocate assigned to her case, and she had sent a single email that said only this: "I understand you drove 6 hours for me. I would like to meet you." They had been meeting for coffee every few weeks since then, and what had started as 2 women connected by one of the worst experiences of either of their lives had become, quietly and genuinely, a friendship. And the kind that gets built by going through something hard together and coming out the other side still choosing each other. Claire had done that for Margaret before she even knew her name, and Margaret intended to spend a long time making sure Claire knew what that meant. In the months following the sentencing, the 3 women, Margaret, Claire, and Donna, founded a small nonprofit they called the Clear Path Project. Its purpose was practical: to help women who had been victims of relational fraud navigate the financial recovery process, understand their legal options, and find each other. Because finding each other, they had learned, was often the thing that made the difference between a woman who spent years trying to be heard by institutions that were not designed to hear her, and a woman who understood she was not alone, and that the record of what had been done to her mattered and was worth building. Beverly joined the board 3 months later. Renee joined after that. By the end of the first year, the Clear Path Project had been contacted by women in 22 states. There is something important about this story that does not fit neatly into the timeline of crimes and investigations and courtroom proceedings, something that does not appear in the police reports or the federal filings or the sentencing documents. Or it is this: every system that was supposed to stop Daniel Carr before he reached Margaret was given the opportunity to do so. The Indianapolis police were approached twice with documented evidence of fraud. The FBI field office was approached once with 200 pages of cross-reference documentation and a clear federal jurisdiction argument. 2 civil courts in 2 different states had already ruled against him in financial fraud cases, and he had an outstanding warrant in Iowa for a probation violation related to a domestic abuse conviction. He had been convicted of identity theft in Kansas. He had a documented history across 5 states that was available to anyone who knew the right search terms and had the access to run them. and he had been allowed, after each of those encounters with the legal system, to simply move to the next city and start again. Not because the evidence was not there, and because the evidence had been evaluated each time by institutions that weighed the cost of pursuing a man who left no bodies and no dramatic crime scenes against the resources required to do so, and decided each time that the cost was not worth it. Claire Novak decided it was worth it. She decided it with 18 months of her evenings and weekends, and with a 200-page file and a 6-hour drive, and a dress she bought for a wedding she had not been invited to. So she decided it because she understood, in a way that the institutions had apparently not been able to, that the cost of not pursuing a man like this is not borne by the institutions. It is borne by the women he finds next. And she had already been one of those women, and she had already paid that cost, and she had decided, quietly and firmly, and without anyone asking her to, that she was not going to let Margaret Hanson pay it too. That is what those 47 seconds were. And they were not just a recording. They were the end result of 18 months of a woman refusing to accept that what had been done to her was simply something she was going to have to absorb and move past. They were the consequence of a system that declined to act, and a woman who decided that if the system would not, she would. They were the sound of one woman standing up for another woman she had never met, in a room full of strangers, on a morning that was supposed to be about joy. And they were the reason that David Russell Connor, who had spent 20 years being every version of himself except the real one, is now sitting in a federal correctional facility with 16 years of his life ahead of him, in which he will have no new cities and no new names and no new women to practice on. Margaret Hanson went back to work at the school district 3 months after the sentencing. The board had lifted her administrative leave within 2 weeks of the arrest. He's with a formal written apology that she accepted graciously and without comment. She went back to the school, and she went back to knowing every student by name and sending handwritten notes home after hard weeks and showing up early and staying late. She renovated the kitchen of her house the following spring, a project she had been planning for 2 years, and that she completed herself over 6 weekends with help from Tyler and Sarah. She did not take down the photographs from the mantelpiece for several months after the wedding because she said that looking at them was part of how she made herself remember that what she had felt during those 3 years had been real, even if the person she had felt it for had not been. She said, "The love was mine. It always was. He didn't take that. He couldn't take that." She was right about that. And she was right about something else, too. Something she said to a room full of women at the first Clear Path Project event 8 months after the sentencing, in a church hall in Columbus that was full of people who had driven from 3 states to be there. She said, "The most important thing I want every person in this room to understand is that being deceived by someone who was very good at deceiving people is not a flaw in your character. It is not evidence that you were careless or naive, or that you should have known better. It is evidence that you were willing to love someone. And the fact that he used that willingness against you says everything about him and nothing, not one single thing, about you." The room was quiet when she said it. Quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something true has been said out loud in a space where everyone present needed to hear it. And then someone in the 3rd row started to clap. And then everyone did. And Margaret Hanson, who had stood at an altar on the morning of October the 14th, in a dress she had chosen with her daughter and flowers she had spent 3 weeks agonizing over, stood at a different kind of altar on a different kind of morning, and received, at last, the thing she had deserved all along. This is what Behind the Lie exists to tell you. Not just the crimes, not just the courtrooms, but the full story, the cost of it, and the courage of it, and the truth that lives on the other side of the worst thing that has ever happened to you. Every story we tell on this channel asks you one question, and the question this story asks is this: if you had been Claire, would you have made that drive? Drop your answer in the comments below. We read every single one. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because somewhere out there is a woman sitting across from someone she believes completely. And the most powerful thing in the world is another woman who already knows how this ends and refuses to look away.